Hello and welcome to this eSchool News webcast. My name's Andrew Barber and I'm a senior contributing editor here at eSchool News. And I want to welcome everyone today to our presentation, which is sponsored by Fuel Education. And over the next hour or so, we're going to be taking a look at what it takes to implement an effective blended learning program. It's my pleasure to introduce you to the first of our speakers, Renae Abboud. Renae is Director of Educational Solution Services at Fuel Education, and she leads a team of education specialists that are responsible for creating innovative and successful online and blended learning programs. And she specializes in working with administrators through all stages of a blended learning implementation, including strategy, design, planning, and evaluation. And before joining Fuel Ed, Renae was a classroom teacher in Oregon and Virginia. Welcome, Renae. It's great to have you back here at eSchool News.
Thank you, Andrew. It is a pleasure to be here again. And today I am especially excited to be here to introduce our speakers for today's topic on blended learning in the 21st century. I've had, as Andrew mentioned, the fortunate privilege to visit and support a variety of blended learning models. And what has interested me the most is to see the amazing transformation that can occur in a traditional comprehensive classroom with a direct shift in how content is delivered and the impact it has not only for the students, but also with the instructional strategies and the direct impact on teachers as well. So I'm sure we'd all agree that blended learning likely has been interpreted to mean so many different things. And it is true, there are a variety of models. And today we are going to hear from two incredible speakers who are going to discuss what blended learning looks like in a classroom. I'm going to introduce them here in just a few minutes, but before I do, I wanted to share a little bit about Fuel Education. At Fuel Ed, our mission is to partner with school districts in a variety of ways, specifically focusing on personalizing the learning experience for students and for teachers. It's important to realize that the shift in personalized learning, it does impact, as I said, both the student learning and instructional practices. And since not one program is like any other, we at Fuel Education strive to meet the needs of each unique district and their specific program goals. And so from a content perspective, to help those schools and reach their initiatives, Fuel Education offers a breadth of course offerings that range, as you can see here, from pre-K solutions to career-focused electives, AP offerings, world language, and a variety of different content areas. And we leverage these resources for a variety of learning needs. And the intent is to really identify what the school's needs are and be able to look at the breadth of offerings and couple that along with our solutions and services that will help to create a blended learning program that supports the full education experience. So to get a deep knowledge and as we get into this topic of blended learning practices, see how this all comes together, I'm excited to introduce our guest speakers, Jason Green and Tiffany Wyckoff. Jason and Tiffany are both co-founders of the Learning Innovation Catalyst, otherwise known as LINC. They both are also co-authors of the book Blended Learning in Action. Now, I'll admit I feel a bit privileged because I've had the great opportunity to meet Jason in person and hear him at a blended learning workshop. And I'm equally as excited to hear him speak again today. Jason has helped hundreds of schools and districts reimagine and implement 21st century teaching and learning in a variety of different implementation models. And through an ongoing research partnership Jason has with Stanford University Graduate School of Education, he also develops and implements professional learning experiences that are designed to help educators build their practice of blended and personalized learning. And I am just as excited to have Tiffany here to join us as well. Tiffany was an early adopter of blended learning at the K-12 level from both the teacher and the school leader perspective. And as a school principal, Tiffany helped her schools to implement those 21st century blended learning models that they're going to share with you today. And she continues to be an advocate for student-centered learning and innovative leadership. Tiffany and Jason, it is such a pleasure to have you here today. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Great, Jason, thank you. Why don't you go ahead and get us started?
All right. Good afternoon and good morning. I see that we have an amazing representation of folks from all over the world. If you haven't had a chance to, I highly recommend scrolling through the group chat that was mentioned earlier. Folks are sharing where they're calling in from. I've seen Guatemala, I've seen Maryland. There's a number of different places all over that folks are calling in from. So it's just exciting, number one, for us to be able to present, have a discussion, hopefully more of a conversation, even in this webinar format, more of a conversation with all of you who are calling in, dialed in. So first, thank you all for jumping on. This is very, very exciting for us to be part of. And what I also want to do is, as you all can see on this first slide here, we have a link. It says bit.ly. And this is a link to, in some ways, a kind of a very short hyperdoc. We call it a learning link. But it's a link to a couple of resources that you'll be able to use and reference both throughout, during, and after the webinar. So Tiffany and I are co-founders of an organization called LINC, which is short for Learning Innovation Catalyst. We support schools in really building a mindset, building practices, and ultimately building culture of true blended learning environments. So today's webinar is going to go into each of those items. We're going to start with some work around mindset, and then Tiffany is going to lead us in really understanding some various practices and things that you can do immediately to really support your blended initiative. I invite you to connect with us on Twitter, and we also have a hashtag BLInAction, where Tiffany and I moderate an ongoing chat every day, an ongoing chat Monday through Thursday, where we do one question per day. So if you're looking to build on and expand your community, your network, even beyond this webinar, we highly invite you to participate there. So without further ado, let's continue on. Our first group chat and interactive experience. What is blended learning and why do we need it now? So what I'd like to do is I'm going to take about 2-3 minutes, and I'm actually going to ask those of you who are dialed in, called in on your screens here, to go ahead and actually take 2 minutes and answer one or both of these questions. This is a quick kind of reflection of what is blended learning to you, and also why you think this is so important right now. So I'm going to pause for about 2 minutes, and hopefully we'll see a bunch of responses coming through right here in the group chat. But one of the interesting things about an actual blended experience is that there is definitely a opportunity for increased student voice, for increased student interaction, and this is something that we believe should be part of every blended experience, even that of a webinar. So the fact that we're actually starting this webinar with a question around what is blended learning and why do we need it now is actually part of a practice in a blended experience. One of the other interesting items that we really have a chance to explore when we're in blended environments is this idea and question around, we're going to talk about it later, is how we can actually create learning environments that really become more personalized to the student. But if you look at the learning link that we've provided, a couple things that you'll see here is that this now becomes a resource and a tool for the individual learner, those folks who are on the webinar now, to even have opportunities to kind of guide and direct your learning even now. So as we're going through this webinar, really also begin to think about the ways in which we're not only incorporating voice, but also how we're trying to make the attempt to really show how learners can have more chances to actually drive and personalize their own learning. So this webinar, we're going to try to focus on a couple of things. First, as I mentioned, is work around mindset. What we call, when we think about mindset, is the spark. So really understanding why this work is so important right now. And then we'll turn it over to Tiffany, who will talk a little bit more about what does this actually look like in a classroom. What is it and what is it not? With a focus on something that we call the PAACC. This is an acronym that stands for personalization, agency, audience, connectivity, and creativity. If we have some time at the end, we'll be able to talk a little bit more, have actually some chances for Q&A, and maybe even some chances to practice what it looks like to actually do a choice station. All right. Now, with all that being said, what we know is that what happens today is a lot less important than what happens beyond this webinar, all right? But to make the most out of today, we really, really recommend that you do as best as you can get involved with the chat, even with the hashtag Bill in Action on Twitter. Commit to taking something back with you in class tomorrow. And keep in mind, take risks. We're big believers in the best and only way to really do this work is through a continuous process of taking risks. All right, so today we'll do a whole group rotation, expand on the understanding of blended learning, distinguish between blended learning and tech integration, and also join in the PAACC, all right? So as we mentioned earlier, the spark for us really reflects our idea of a mindset shift, okay? It's really the question or need that drives the excitement to learn something new or to shift to a new way of thinking. One of the ways we can think about this is this idea of what will the future look like for our students? Just take a moment, look at the picture, and if you can get it into the chat, go ahead and just type in what you think this is a picture of. All right, so this is a picture of an Amazon warehouse that's actually live and going today. And again, what is this a picture of? These are the Amazon robots that are actually now a huge part of what is really driving warehouses, factories. And what we don't see in these pictures is, you guessed it, people. So many futurists predict that by the year 2035, and this is the next question, what percentage of jobs will be lost to automation? All right, I'll give another quick couple of seconds for folks to think about this. 38% is the answer that many futurists predict that by the year 2035, as many as 38% of the jobs currently available in the U.S. may be actually lost to automation. And it's also predicted that students today will likely have to reinvent themselves multiple times during the course of their lives just to stay relevant for the workforce. Anybody want to guess what number that is? 5. Imagine right now, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, whatever your career is, having to reinvent yourself because the thing that you do has completely been done away with, is no longer needed because of the advancements with technology. So how does all of this relate to a conversation about blended learning? Well, here's how we think it becomes very, very relevant. So back in 2016, Gallup Poll did a survey where they found that only half of adolescents reported feeling engaged during school. And what we also found was that, or what they found was that engagement actually decreases as students get older. So there's a real challenge that we have to recognize as educators, and that is that for many classrooms and for many learners, just looking at achievement doesn't necessarily equate to learning. What we found is that when students are more engaged in classrooms, that it's engagement that actually drives learning. And ultimately, we must ask ourselves the question of what actually drives engagement. Well, curiosity drives engagement. And we believe at Link that the real kind of elephant in the room is that students are deeply, deeply curious, but they're taking their curiosity elsewhere. And I think all of you that work with students, that have children, see that students are, learners are spending hours on YouTube, on Minecraft, and all kinds of things. But when it comes to what's happening in the classroom, we see a very, very different picture. And so this idea of how can we begin to use blended learning as a way to bring curiosity back into the classroom and also really support what we believe is the most important thing that we can help students do, and that is become generative learners so that they have a chance to actually operate more effectively in their world. So generativity becomes now this idea of continuous growth from self and shared reflection and iteration. Generativity also is what we believe is the most important thing that we can do with our students is help them actually learn how to learn. This is ultimately the goal of a blended experience, is for students to become truly the drivers of their learning. Now, with that in mind, when we see many blended environments or environments that are thought to be blended, what ends up happening is we actually see classrooms that look more like this, where the structural design of the classroom actually hasn't changed considerably. We've got students still largely in a teacher-centered environment, many students still doing largely the same kind of work or mode of work. And this is actually, as we're going to learn in a few minutes from Tiffany, this is actually not the ultimate goal in a true blended environment. So as we actually think about and really, really prepare ourselves and our students for the world that they'll face, and also the role that technology will be able to play in transforming learning, we have to really make sure that the work that we're doing with technology is supporting, preparing students for the world that they will face. I will now turn it over to Tiffany to continue to kind of drive the conversation of what does blended learning look like and how are the practices playing themselves out in classrooms?
The question that we asked at the beginning was, what is blended learning to you? And a couple people put answers to this in the chat box, and I wanted to just touch back on a couple of those. Somebody put combining different learning strategies to reach the needs of every learner. And another person put different pedagogical strategies combined with the use of technology. And so there were some really interesting, and if you haven't had a chance to add your working definition of blended learning, I invite you to do so in that chat right now so that you can develop and contribute to really what has become evolving collective wisdom around what blended learning should look like in a classroom. So what I wanted to point out in this slide here, however, is that often what we see when tech integration is the lead people think they're doing blended learning because there's some tech in the room, maybe a teacher device, a smartboard in use, even, as Jason pointed out a couple slides back, a one-to-one program. But that's not really what blended learning looks like. And so we're going to go through a definition and a series of kind of what blended learning is not versus what blended learning is. But the main contrast here is this picture on the left where you see students in rows and some technology in the room that is not really being used to hit that PAACC, as opposed to the picture on the right where you see one student working by herself on a technology device and other students in the room engaged in that digital learning usage, while the teacher is able to be guide on the side and coaching a student through the use of technology and offline opportunities. So the definition, sort of official definition, which emerged out of the Christensen Institute research and also our combined research, is blended learning involves leveraging technology to afford each student a more personalized learning experience, meaning increased student control over time, place, path, and or pace of his or her learning. And so one of the things that I want you to be thinking about as we go through this presentation is really this concept of agency, and that if we're doing blended learning correctly, we are really hitting that PAACC mark, personalizing the experience. That means students are not all doing the same thing. We're not just combining a variety of learning modes to hit perhaps one that works for a group of students. But it's really cultivating a sense of ownership alongside the students through the leveraging of technology. And really that means that we're changing the paradigm from how do we integrate more technology into the classroom to how do we reach individual students and help them become much more generative. How do we use blended learning to create professional learners in our students? So here's a series of blended learning is not just. So to sort of take a step back and define blended learning by what it's not but is often confused for, we'll do this sort of series of it's not just teachers using technology. So it's definitely not more of the same in a different new way. It's really reimagining not just what learning looks like in the classroom, but also the role of the teacher, where the teacher is not the person directing all of the learning. Blended learning is not simply combining different types of learning. So here we see a lot of really great pedagogical approaches, and actually we see a combination of modes from reading to really hands-on tinkering to exploratory learning outside. Putting these together would not yield a blended learning outcome as defined. There is a specific integration of technology that happens in blended learning that is required to kind of qualify as blended learning. It's also not simply practicing with game apps as a digital station or a digital activity. That's certainly a component of blended learning, but sometimes we hear teachers say, oh, I'm doing some blended learning. I'm having my students use a supplemental tool I'm having my students use a supplemental tool to practice some of their skills. And blended learning is not just reading, researching, and writing with technology. So again, this is sort of that substitution level of tech integration. If you're familiar with that SAMR model, substitution is the first. We're just doing the same thing, but in new ways. There's definitely an element of reading, researching, and writing, but that's not what blended learning is. And then it's also not just taking some online courses at school. And so the a la carte model, which is the model whereby students enroll in online classes and they have a space within their school to access that class and complete their work, is one form of blended learning, but that's certainly not the extent of it. And it's actually the one that requires the highest level of student capacity for independent work and is often not the one to start with if you're thinking about how do you build a bridge to that online learning capacity for students. So what is blended learning then? So there are a number of models, as Renae mentioned, and some schools prefer to run with one specific model, whereas other schools have a combination of models. But wherever you find it, what you're essentially looking at is a combination of online and face-to-face learning. So that in this slide, for example, you have the teacher station up on the left at the top, and this is from the book Blended Learning in Action for those of you who have it. This is sort of your classic diagram of a station rotation where they are meeting with the teacher in small groups up on the left, the students are, and then they're moving into the different stations in different sequences depending on their group. Where one of the stations down below, station number 4, is an online learning station, and then you might have a collaborative station and an independent offline workstation. But it's a combination of online and face-to-face learning. And this is another model of that, which is a whole group rotation, where everybody is online at the same time and then rotating offline at the same time and then rotating into a one-to-one usage of technology. This diagram is a playlist, and that is a more flexible and individual rotation model where these larger circles represent time either within a day or within a class period where the group is doing work together, and those are synchronous moments. And then in the other areas where there are smaller circles, you have playlist activity. And that is really asynchronous because what a playlist is, when you hear that term, is a list of tasks that have been individually assigned to learners. Some of them are digital, some of them are offline, face-to-face, and then the learner moves through those in a way that makes sense to them, and they might collaborate with their teacher to decide what the right sequence is, or they might have full control over that as long as they get it done by a certain time or date. And so the idea around the small circle time is that there's a combination of modes of learning, some of them online, some of them offline, and then you still have that feeling within a class of a community and shared learning experience. Because one of the things that has emerged in the research area of blended learning is the importance that some experiences be shared between a whole class. And so that you don't want to get to a point where you're personalizing to such an extent that that synchronicity and shared cultural experience is lost within the group. Blended learning is very student-centered and student-driven, so this is going back to this idea of agency and really students being the drivers of learning. And the main goal here is to help them, again, develop those muscles of generativity so that they're really prepared to always be asking themselves the question, where am I, where do I need to go, and what resources and help do I need to get there? So to do that, they really have to be empowered with the sense of ownership of that reflection and that shared collaboration around their learning. This graphic here comes from the Personalized Learning Continuum authors of Barbara Bray and Kathleen McClaskey, who have the PDI framework, the difference between personalized, differentiated, individualized learning, which is definitely worth checking out. But you can see that we're going from this sort of expression level of like when you get a chance to express your idea, which is the lower level of sort of conditional contribution, towards a much more leadership-oriented model driven by the learner, and that also includes their co-planning and making decisions about their learning goals and activities. Blended learning is supposed to be collaborative and connected. So one of the fears around blended learning implementation is that this would mean more screen time and more disconnected time for kids who are interacting with artificial intelligence as opposed to their peers and their teachers. And that's really the lowest outcome of a well thought out blended learning model. When we're really hitting the mark on blended learning, what we're doing is we are leveraging the technology to increase the connection between the humans in the room, whether that is the teacher and the student, or in this case, this example is students working together, collaborating on both offline and online on a class magazine project. Blended learning is aligned and integrated. So sometimes initiatives can take a sort of circumnavigate standards by being a supplemental add-on or something that amounts to digital fluff at a digital station that's a go-to when you're finished with the real learning. That's not the best use of the blended learning models. This screenshot is a standards-based learning management system called Seesaw. And basically what it allows you to do is identify the different learning standards and have the activities very aligned to those standards and really let learners know where they are in the continuum of learning towards that standard. And there are a number of tools that are developed to help with that on a digital end. But the point of this explanation is that when we're planning for blended learning, we're still doing diligence and going back to what is our targeted learning outcome and what are the tools that make sense to empower the learner to achieve that outcome. Blended learning is a creative mindset over models. And what we mean by this is when you go to do blended learning, you say, I'm going to do a station rotation. You might do station rotation and it's beautifully run. You have a timer, students are moving around the room. And unfortunately, you can miss the mark on that real personalized, agency-oriented experience for the learner. So it's a great thing to experience and pass through because everybody needs to pass through maybe some not highly differentiated station rotation practice with the goal of getting there, but you don't want to get stuck on a model specifically when that might not be the best model that serves every circumstance, and the model itself might not get you to the outcome of personalization. So this is really thinking about how am I combining and tweaking my station rotation model and really continuing to iterate on it. Having given that sort of overview of effective, like just sort of the yes and no on what is blended learning and a little bit about the models, what we wanted to emphasize here is that the hallmarks of effective practice provide a better compass than any particular model. So we really wanted to develop in writing the book, Blended Learning in Action, a tool where teachers could ask themselves the question, am I getting it right? And have a good sense of the direction. And that's how we came up with the PAACC, Hallmarks of 21st Century Learning Practices. So you have personalization here, co-creating unique learning pathways for students, agency, giving learners opportunities to participate in key decisions and in their learning experiences. And so that might be some level of choice, but it's also really co-planning sometimes with a student, reviewing their data with them, alongside them, and asking them, what do you think you should be targeting next? Giving students an authentic audience, that's when we're really seeing the power of connected learning, whether this is a peer group across the world that you can get students connected to, or giving them a voice to their parents or within the classroom. The authentic audience piece is really important, and then very closely related to that is the connectivity piece, where we can give them opportunities to learn in collaboration with peers and experts locally and globally. And then creativity is really providing individual and collaborative opportunities to make things that matter, and keeping in mind that sort of ambiguous skill set of the future that is going to require our students to iterate over and over again to stay relevant in their careers. And then underline all of this, just fidelity of really taking formative data and circling it back to drive the new pathways of learning for each student. To give a little bit of more color to the PAACC, we're just pulling from, I think Jason mentioned earlier, we have a Twitter chat, BL in Action, that is a slow chat, and it's designed to sort of get people sharing with others trying to implement practices in their classroom, what might be some strategies that are working for them. So these examples that you're seeing here come from that Twitter chat, and there are others on it if you want to do a deeper dive. Personalization here, we see a playlist that's actually created and given to students in an offline format down here on the left, but then it allows the students to sort of move through their online and offline tasks and self-assess what they've completed and not completed. And then up on the right, we have flexible student choice stations. So you can design a station rotation that really has choice involved, where students go where they need to go, and you have suggested times to move, and it's a little bit more agency-oriented version of the model. Another example of agency is empowering students with classroom responsibility to build capacity to answer peer questions, support each other, support themselves. So many are familiar with the Ask Three Before Me mantra, which we hear spoken in classrooms frequently to avoid the run on the teacher for every single learning need and getting unstuck. This is a version of that, the SOS card. This teacher gives an SOS card to students, and they can keep it. The incentive is to not use it and to ask other friends before, asking the teacher. And if they have their SOS card by the end of the rotation or the end of the week, then there's an incentive behind that. But other versions of this are a real-life Siri, for example, in the classroom, where students can have the job of answering questions and getting students unstuck while teachers are at the teacher station, or a tech help desk like a Geek Squad responsibility. And you'd be surprised how amazing sometimes the least engaged students become hyper engaged when that skill set is tapped into for them. So a lot of the same students tend to have that sort of, I'm great at being a techie and I also need stimulation. So, I found that when I was teaching, that sometimes my more disruptive students became really, really helpful in that area when empowered with that responsibility. An example of audience here, so this is a classic, writing to my congressman about why ocean acidification is an issue. Authentic audience really starts with authentic task. So when we talk about audience, we talk about engaging students in deciding, well, what would be the most appropriate audience for a specific task, and engaging their agency in deciding that, and even reaching out to those audience members on behalf of the class. Here's an example of connectivity within the class, uploading to the chosen learning management system of Canvas and collaborating, discussing with each other, creating a student rubric so that they can then use it for their Genius project, which for those of you who are unfamiliar, it's basically a student hour of the week where they get to work on an ongoing project, and it's modeled after Google's 20% time for personal projects. And then this looks like a silly example of creativity, but it's students really sharing their digital citizenship commitments and learning commitments via Flipgrid, via video, and getting to play around with some of the features there. So a lighthearted way to really build that capacity as digital citizens. So I've shared a lot about, the sort of surface level what the models look like, and also what the PAACC compass is. And I think it's important for both of us to emphasize here that when we work with teachers and schools to start this implementation and classroom transformation, there's a certain dreaming big but starting small that can occur, and really just affording yourself that growth mindset, recognizing that you're going to start with something that is within the zone of your proximal development and current practice, and then, have a Jedi vision in mind, as our friend that shared out on Twitter here has, but then be really open to that growth mindset. I'm going to turn it back over to Jason to take us into an internalize exercise here.
Tiffany, thank you so much. What Tiffany just covered really represents both the way in which we really believe that technology can become, as she said, not just another thing in a classroom, but really be part of revolutionizing what an experience for a learner actually is. With that being said, we also recognize in this work that just like the image there of Yoda, most teachers, most educators, when you're first starting this process out and when you're first starting to really, really take the risks that are involved, it's going to take some real time before it becomes, as we call it, becomes internalized. We look at internalization as the frequent repetition of a new behavior until it becomes a sustained part of practice. It's often that we have to do things in classrooms maybe 7, 8, 9, 10, multiple times over before it actually becomes a thing that we become comfortable with. And with that being said, part of how we want to kind of close out and move to ending this webinar is giving us a chance to actually think about what it means to internalize these new behaviors, and even to do a little bit of practice in this regard. What you see on your screen now, hopefully, is a list of various actions, various options that all refer back to a choice station. So you might remember that one of the models that Tiffany just spoke about was kind of the station rotation model. She spoke about the playlist model. All of those are kind of things that a teacher can have in their toolbox in thinking about the design of a lesson. So even right now in this webinar, I want to take a moment, just about 2 or 3 minutes, and we're going to experiment with a choice station. So if you go back to the link, you'll notice that there are a couple of options that you have and things that you can play with, exploring the BL in action hashtag, looking at an article that we found, or even watching a video. And there's an option 1, which is a Q&A, okay? Right now, there are some folks that are listening to this webinar that are saying, I would love to spend some time with the teacher and kind of ask some more questions. For others, you might be saying, I would love to go and start to do my own research and tinkering. And for others, you might say, I want to go deeper. I need to get a little bit more foundational knowledge. That is actually the point and purpose of a blended classroom, is to create enough modalities that are happening within that classroom and enough available so that regardless of what a student needs, what we're creating is a chance for that student to actually receive the best next step in their instructional journey. So with that being said, what I'd like to do is open this up now to you all that are on the webinar having an option. We have some time for Q&A, and if others would like to actually explore some of the links, you're welcome to as well. So let's go ahead and actually transition to a Q&A.
We have a couple questions that are in Q&A right now, and maybe we can go ahead and start with one of those. I'm happy to take one that is around how should we think about choosing digital tools. What we advise for teachers in schools in this area is really thinking about, how can I maximize the technology that is already available and which model makes most sense? So for example, station rotation, you don't need one-to-one. You could have just a handful of digital devices and have that work as a starting model. So a lot of schools feel like they can't get started until they have more devices, but there's usually some way of starting that process. The other piece of that is to really think about tools that have big PAACC impact and have just a few core tools that you use all the time. One of them being a learning management system, which is a really important part of the digital toolbox in a blended learning environment. It's also sometimes referred to as an LMS. And these could be, anywhere from, I think I mentioned Seesaw as an example earlier, Schoology, Canvas, Google Classroom. There are a number of platforms that kind of cover that need and allow for online discussions, communication with your students. So that is a piece of the core toolbox. And then what also goes into that are your go-to, sort of if you look at the PAACC and think, well, do I have a tool that really empowers creativity? Do I have a tool that really empowers audience? Most schools will pick a productivity environment, which has a suite of applications like either Google for Education or Microsoft. And you can really get a lot out of those platforms in a collaborative way if you're using the collaboration options. So there's a big impact on those. And then in the other area, we would say just pick some digital curriculum. Fuel Ed has some great options, of course, and then really align it with those learning outcomes and maximize the usage in terms of getting the data you can get from it, really getting feedback from students on how effective it's being used, and then slowly add more tools to your toolbox, but not to overwhelm it at the beginning. Jason, is there anything else that you would want to add to that?
No, I think you really nailed it. And I think the one thing I would add before we close out, I'm going to pass it back over to Renae from Fuel Ed, is really think about, for those of you just getting started, is maybe 3 to 5 tools that you become comfortable with, and as Tiffany said, you build your toolbox. And that's a way to not get overwhelmed as you're starting to think about and create things that really will add to your students' instructional needs. So don't overwhelm yourself early. Think about just a small handful of initial tools, and that's really a great way to get started. So with that, I want to say thank you to my partner, co-founder, co-author, Tiffany Wyckoff, for supporting the facilitation of this. I also want to thank again eSchool News and Fuel Ed, and I'm going to turn it back over to Renae to close this out.
Great. Jason and Tiffany, thank you so much. This was a great opportunity to learn from you and to identify the incredible perspective that you both have, and what wonderful tools I am sure the audience is taking away ready to implement in their classrooms. This was fantastic. Thank you. Just to give everyone the opportunity before you leave, feel free to reach out to Fuel Education for any additional resources and information you might have regarding blended learning. And Jason had left his information as well up on the screen. Hopefully you captured that. And Andrew, I wanted to thank you for having us participate with you today as well.
All right. Well, thank you, Renae. I really appreciate it. And thank you to you and Jason and Tiffany for a really excellent presentation. And so as we wrap up, again, I want to thank Jason Green, Tiffany Wyckoff, and Renae Abboud again for their presentations. I'd also like to thank Fuel Education for its support. And that is it. So we have concluded, and I will say goodbye to you all at this point. So thank you again, and look for you next time. Goodbye.